tension. The experience of tension is just being aware of like the possibility or a feeling or a sense that something could be different between us, right? It maybe is like, oh, I kind of don't like this and I want it to change. Or, oh, I want more of that and I want it to change in that direction.
The container is now open. Okay, today we have an interview that gives you a ton of useful tools. Like, immediately useful. Like, you'll listen to this interview and then the next conversation you have will be vastly improved. I promise you. That's because we talked to Michael Porcelli of MetaRelating. He's gathered all of these strands from things like authentic relating, but also more academic sources and people like Ken Wilber and practices like circling. And he's weaved together a hyper practical system of looking at how people relate to one another. If it's a bunch of people together, you can probably use meta relating tools. We start off the conversation by talking about exactly what that term meta relating actually means and how many levels it actually works on. Then we just dive right in and talk about the we creature, which is Porcelli's illustration of this kind of third entity in any relationship. As soon as I learned about the we creature, I I was off to the races. It is such a great way to frame how we move in a relationship to improve our connection. It's also extremely cool, which I'm always appreciative of. But before we jump into that conversation, I just want to give a shout out and an enormous thank you to our patrons. They went to patreon.com/thecontainer and they plopped down their $5 a month to support the work we do. It helps content like this get created and helps it exist in the future. So thank you to everyone who supports us. As a way of giving back, we continue to create special content that only patrons get to see. And we're actually right now in the process of coming up with some more unique one-off things that are gonna be really fun and exciting for you. So thank you so much. Okay, now our talk with Michael Porcelli. Michael Porcelli, welcome to the container.
Hey,
We are
good to
so
be here.
grateful to have you on. Yeah, and I guess I want to start by hearing a little bit about you and the company you've built and this sort of pillar of like American relational arts that you've created.
I love that introduction. Yeah. So I've got a company and a set of practices that I call meta relating right now. And it is highly influenced by authentic relating and circling, but also it actually draws from other things like NBC and a number of other sources. And it is kind of my take. It's a much more systematic approach in a way to applying, you might say, like conscious, intentional, or healthy relational communication practices into everyday life, including workplace. I'm especially focused on the workplace, but I've tried to kind of identify the kinds of recurring patterns that just come up in relational dynamics and how to communicate effectively about them, because whatever context we're in, right, at home or family of origin, like human relationships are human relationships, right? And communication is communication. So what's that kind of like relational protocol layer, you might say, that
Mm.
like exists across all these spaces? And can that be systematically taught in a real practical way? And that's been like my goal with creating this version, you might say, of relational practices that I'm currently deep into.
I love so meta relating really is like what are the kind of meta structures of relating that we could maybe universally apply. That's so exciting.
Yeah, yeah. There's a number of ways that meta word or that meta prefix comes in, like that one you just said, which is sort of like what are the kind of like communication and relational processes that we can use this sort of our meta and apply across multiple domains. Another one is just kind of the thing that you're maybe used to doing when you do authentic relating and circling, which is like, can you meta this moment, right? It seems like we are like having a podcast interview or whatever. You know what I'm saying? Like, oh, you're not liking this, or like we're in a tension, escalating tension, right? That putting words to the moment, that's another way that it applies. And then also, I think a third way, which often doesn't get talked about in authentic relating circles, is this idea that like our relationship itself has a structure, right? It's like you could sort of say it's a thing that exists in our minds or in our consciousness that sort of represents the relationship itself, and it itself evolves over time and is built of the things like what are our shared understandings of what's going on, or what are the agreements that we have made, or what's this story about how we met and how we got here, and maybe the little twists and turns we took along the way. That is the structure of the relationship itself. It's not just a structure for teaching communication, it's actually recognizing like we're in a process of like building and evolving our relationship together. And that's just true of all relationships, right? Some of them just remain relatively simple, right? Like a you go to the coffee shop and you order a coffee and there's a little brief exchange, but they can become, especially for like a marriage, a very significant thing, right? Almost like a you could open up a storybook and be like, and here is how this relationship started, and here's all the little places that it went on its journey. So that's another sense in which it's kind of meta, I think.
Wow.
I
Yeah.
love that.
It reminds me of a very simple dyad practice that is in the authentic relating games manual. Is it the perspective yoga?
I think so. Yeah.
Where
You love running that game.
I
You run that game every chance you get.
but one of the it builds layers of perspective, and one of the perspectives is that meta layer, like where you're talking, you and your dyad partner are only discussing the connection, or like the it's even further out from the connection. It's like the entity that is the two of you in this dyad in this moment,
Hmm.
as
Yes,
from an outside view. It sounds like
totally.
what you're describing.
Yeah, I call it the relational entity often, or sometimes it's called the third entity or the third body. Sometimes I call it the we creature. But if you're sort of like, well, I seem this way, you seem this way, but we seem this way, right? That third one is starting to touch into it's like your perspective on this entity as a whole and my perspective on this entity as a whole are two parts of what it is, right?
Wow. Yeah. I love that.
What's coming up for me
Hmm.
hearing that, like in the perspective yoga, something that often happens is like almost sort of a psychedelic kaleidoscope once you try to hold all that in your head. Or like I'm hearing you talk about the we, and I'm thinking about the like um you could almost call it like the Christ consciousness, where there's that saying like where two or three of you are together, I am there, and the idea that like well there's some kind of loving connection create is like this like higher level of existence, and those are like very far out mind-bending places to go.
Yes.
But I think something that is really compelling to me about your work is that like you have done a lot to make connect these things to practical tools where human beings can actually interact and use them, which that seems like that would be more common. But actually, my experience is that in like circling communities, especially, we get really far out, and sometimes that creates a style of relating that just blows out your cousin at the get together, or you know
Totally. Yeah, yeah. I totally understand what you're saying, and I agree. Like there is something what cosmic or psychedelic or just this triune entity. What is this thing? And that's definitely not where I start the training. I usually start or even just kind of like getting people interested. It's more like, hey, tension. The experience of tension is just being aware of like the possibility or a feeling or a sense that something could be different between us, right? It maybe is like, oh, I kind of don't like this and I want it to change. Or, oh, I want more of that and I want it to change in that direction. Whatever this is, right? It often manifests as like a desire, right? A moving towards or a moving away from, right? Or maybe there's a little bit of an extra judgment in there, like, oh man, like they suck in this way, or they're ignorant in this way, or maybe if you're kind of more down on yourself, if you have that tendency, you might be kind of like, well, I feel like I kind of suck, or I'm not really good enough or something right now. Like, any of those things are just indicators of just the existence of tension, whatever that is. And oftentimes it just appears like, hey, I want to ask for something. I w- uh, can we talk about something that's going on so we can maybe like have this be more enjoyable for both of us, like more fulfilling, having more of the kind of relationship that like we want to be having with each other. So that wherever the tension is sourced from, oftentimes it just feels like, oh, well, can this relationship move in a particular direction? And what would it take to get from here to there? Like, what's the next small step? And then maybe you can talk about it. And that's where the whole relational communication comes. It comes after you sort of sense this tension or this possibility. I like the word tension because a lot of people feel it in a kind of a negative way, although it can have a positive valence. A lot of people are like, oh, of course, I know exactly what you mean when you're talking about attention in my relationship with somebody. I'm like, cool, that thing right there, right? Like, what do you do with that?
This point about tension, I think, is just absolutely crucial. It's such a frequent doorway we find ourselves standing in front of, isn't it? Like, we'll be in connection with someone, and then we just feel the tension rise up, and man, it would be really nice if we could just back off and retreat and just avoid all conflict, right? I know that's what you're thinking, because that's what I have thought for the most part for the last 30, almost 35 years. But meta relating as a system reminds us that these moments of tension are little bells ringing, little bells that remind us that we can be called into actual conversations about the relating itself. In other words, there are openings to start taking care of the we creature more directly. By the way, having this we creature reference, I see it as this sweet monster, sort of like in Where the Wild Things Are. This like kind of adorably part ferocious, part cuddly teddy bear, part plant, I think, in my mind. That has vines growing out, kind of like Biolante. Shout out to my Heisei era Godzilla fans. Anyways, coming up, Porcelli takes this idea out for a spin. How do we use these moments of tension as doorways into the practice? It then opens up this discussion on things like dishonesty and hypocrisy, which we often frame as sins of other people, but really, when you think about it, they're illnesses that the we creature is suffering, and they're often illnesses that both members of a relationship have a part to play in.
I had like a very recent and kind of concrete example of a tension that came up for me in our connection. If
Hmm?
that I want to
Okay.
share, because I want to kind of understand like more of this thing that you're talking about with the with zooming in on the tension, and like how that can then I'm also maybe kind of looking for advice.
While we have you on the call.
Or like wanting to explore this, because it's something that has come up for me recently, which is that we do a lot of mindfulness practice, and Jonathan and I are I think I'm like proud to say that we are really in practice in our connection. But
Mhm.
you can't get everything like you can't get to everything all the time. And something I've noticed that's come up a lot lately is that I will find myself wanting him to be different than he is. Like I'm
Yeah.
wanting him to be different in some very small way than what he's being. And so I'm like looking at my thought around that, and like noticing that that's causing frustration or anger or annoyance. Um
Mhm.
and then I don't know, I'm like, what do I do with that? Like, is it fair for me to say I want you to be different than you are? Or is it just all my work to go, okay, this is what I need to accept and allow in this, because that is this is my judgment, or this is my issue. um and
Mhm.
yeah, so that's kind of, yeah,
Yeah. I mean,
what's coming up.
you nailed it. That's exactly where the starting point is. That's what the tension is. Um,
Right.
and another thing that I'll often repeat is any relational dynamic has some contribution coming from both sides of the relationship, whatever it is, right? So if you're
Yeah.
kind of like, "Oh," and like it appears in your awareness, like I want him to be different, right? That's a little bit of a partial but incomplete point of view on like what's actually causing the thing that would have you say that. Like
Mm,
whatever's causing the thing that would have you say that, there maybe is something that he is doing or saying or not saying that you would rather he did or said differently,
right.
right? But there's probably something that you are also doing or not doing or saying that is together creating the thing that has you go, I want him to be different. You see what I'm saying?
Yes, I do. Yeah.
That is such a great insight. And beginning this discussion with you, like you having this, like the third entity, really helped that click into place for me. Like, really, what we want is changes to that third entity, which we were both creating. So there's like some system there.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it reminds me. It reminds me of this difficult working relationship uh earlier this year. um I had where I like my perception was that um my like colleague, my collaborator was being dishonest with me.
Mhm.
And then I mean we went through so much practice around that, so much sessions. And then what I came to realize was that like um part of being honest is having someone who makes it easy to be honest too. And it was like the first time in my life I realized, whoa, I have a part to play in how honest people are with me.
Yes.
Yes.
That is like crazy. It's like, oh my lord, that is such good medicine. That like,
Oh
yeah.
yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes they'll say, like this kind of comes up in organizations a lot, like management or something. It's like, we are open for your feedback and we want to hear how good we're doing, but we also want to hear if like you think we should be doing something different or something is not working for you. And then they say it, blah, blah, blah. And then you're like, okay, cool. I'll say something. And you're like, hey, well, what about this? And if the first thing that they say is, oh, well, you just don't understand.
Right.
We really, in a good way, you get it? So, like, now I'm saying that I'm open to your feedback, but my initial response is to sort of tell you how you're experiencing it wrong.
Mm.
so that it just goes away and nothing has to change over here, right?
Oh.
It could be that there is some more mutual understanding that needs to happen, but it really is sort of the sequence of the communication that does sort of signal your receptivity. They'll just see you as a hypocrite if you're sort of like, hey, we're open to feedback. And then the first thing that you're saying in response to feedback is trying to get them to think or feel differently. Then people will
Mm,
go like, you're not really open to feedback. And
Yeah.
this will have people be less honest with you.
mm. That reminds me of there's this old saw I heard once. When written rules and unwritten rules disagree, people follow unwritten rules.
Yes.
And there's like something I'm hearing of that kind of principle. Like the way you behave in a relationship sets up unwritten rules of the relationship, and those are the true rules. And any explicit saying of what the relationship is basically like window dressing or
Hmm.
kayfabe.
Yeah, I don't know if it's like total like bullshit or whatever. I mean, it's maybe partially right. Like there is a role for like, well, this is what I want. This is what I
Mm,
do. Or like, but there is kind of like, what I say that I value or believe in or whatever. And then there's like how I actually behave in the world. And I mean, I think there's a reason why hypocrisy is just one of those things that everyone sort of has some version of like, I don't like it when I see it, is because in a way, we all do that to some extent, right? Like
Yeah.
I have the person I think I am in my best image of myself. And when I'm at my best, I behave consistently with that. But inevitably, I don't totally measure up to my aspirational self all of the time. But that's just sort of true for everybody. But in the sense in which what you said is true, is it like we sort of fall back onto the unwritten rules when there's a contradiction? That's also a thing that tends to happen as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
mm. At this point of the discussion, we're about to turn to this ongoing dilemma. The something that I know in my relations, especially with Sai, we have a lot of difficulty around, which is answering this question about what is my personal work and what is something I bring to the relationship. For instance, if there's a problem in our connection around how I'm experiencing something you do, well, how much of that is just mine to own and for me to look into my patterns and see why I'm responding the way I am, and if I can heal that part, then like the relationship, the connection is like back, right? Well, yeah, but it makes the we creature solely our responsibility, and it's not solely our responsibility. And we can bring in collaboration to switch it up. So, yeah, there are these two different ways of fixing problems. Notice I'm putting all this in quotation marks because there's probably some listeners out there who are floating on a cloud of samadhi, living in total non-duality, who none of this even makes sense for. But like, if we focus on the we creature, does that make it a little bit easier to determine if this is a me and you thing that we can change, or if it's the issue is something that I can just handle on my own? Is the good stuff.
There's this, it's a funny little tangle that I find myself getting into a lot, and I think it's because, I'd rather not engage in something that feels like conflict. I mean, that's like my baseline. I don't want to go into a conflict or bring difficult things to the connection. Like I just generally would rather not do that. And so I think that unconsciously I'm often trying to find ways to avoid doing that. And
Sure.
one of the ways is by being like, oh, well, this is my issue. It's, like I have this problem with you, and I need to deal with it on my own. But then here I am pouting, right? And he's like, what's wrong? And I'm like, I'm fine. And it's like such a common. I feel like it's almost like a very common relationship dynamic. Um, but as we're
Yes.
talking, I'm realizing like there feels like there's kind of this comfort in having this third or comfort. Like it seems like going into a conversation with Jonathan about these challenges I'm experiencing with the idea of this we, what did you call it? Um,
Creature.
the we creature. Like our we creature needs some help.
Yeah.
It feels like a little less edgy and more workable, like to just kind of start there. Um, and yeah, I'm
Yeah.
curious what else you would suggest.
Well, that I loved that you said it in that way, that it sort of makes it feel more workable, because I think that is one of the practical consequences of having this additional sort of third concept available. Like it sort of performed exactly what I thought it would do when you
Yeah.
said that. I was like, all right, the win. Um, and the this thing that you said earlier about like, well, maybe I should figure out what I'm doing or how I could maybe be different. I know you didn't say it exactly that way, but this when it sort of looks like one or the other. I need him to be different, or this is just my thing and I will figure out how to be different, right?
Hmm.
Well, there's the that's not purely a relational thing. It's also a thing that kind of has come from what I call like therapeutic culture, like this
Mm,
kind of like post psychotherapeutic culture that we are all kind of inside of as modern people. I think this kind of jargon and this lingo, my unconscious and my ego and whatever, my past or my trauma, right? Like my inner child and these, I'm kind of making a little bit of fun of it. I mean, these things are good and valid and useful, right? But they tend to sort of like individualize the thing in a
hmm.
way, which is it's a valid point of view, right? What is this reflecting to me about my past or my unresolved issues? Or what pattern is this kind of recreating maybe from my family of origin, say, right? And
Hmm.
you do this where you kind of like, okay, I will go to my trusted advisor or my counselor, or I'll do my journaling practice or whatever it is to try to like peel back the layers inside of my own psychodynamics, right? That's
Hmm.
sort of like you as an individual have an internal system and you can have little dialogues inside yourself to figure out, let's all get on board with this, or let's heal this wound, right? Or let's transform this thing. And then you come back and maybe that thing you're kind of like, hey, it went away, right? I actually figured out how to be different and now the situation happens and doesn't bother me anymore. Well, in a way that's also good for the weak creature, right? Like, but it might be that there's some remainder that is kind of like, but what do we do now? Right? Like, cool. I'm working on my triggers and my trauma with my therapist. Awesome. But still the situation keeps happening. What do we want to choose in terms of our dynamic? Like when this comes up, you do this and I say this, but I would rather that we did it in a kind of a different way.
Yeah.
And you're not trying to get yourself to be different and you're not trying to get the other person to be different. It really is more behavioral. What are you doing and what are you saying? And what are they doing and what are they saying? And what are different scripts you might say you could install different that would like benefit the weak creature, right? And it's no longer about like you be different. It's just like you do different for the creature, right? Like, you see what I'm
Yeah.
saying?
Yeah. I love that.
That balance between the inner work
Mm-hmm.
and the relational work feels, talk about tension, that feels like sort of a balance that makes it an ongoing art form itself of relating, where you're like, uh I can, yeah, I can imagine, so yeah, balancing with each iteration of like a struggle, trying to find, I want to develop myself as much as possible, whatever that could possibly mean. um, but yeah, and in a lot of ways, like like when we spoke with Susan Campbell, something that I think she brings up that's really valuable is how these partners are such a great source of triggers, and that triggers are such a good um, flagging system for work to do to become more yourself and more authentic and just more happy in here.
uh,
um and then but then there's also this, yeah, so it's there's such value on both sides, because there's also, so that there's like a selfless and self-overcoming thing about that I like, but then there's also, um I really like the idea of being in service to the relationship also feels very selfless and self-overcoming in its own way, and it allows for a kind of sweetness uh that it feels so special and sort of less um like hard-nosed in the dojo 5 a.m. It's like a little more sweet and nice, which is, this orientation to our relationships as places where we are really bringing a lot of effort and practice and conscious care, it can sort of bring about this common issue that happens with personal development, where you have a lot of enthusiasm early on, and then as the months go by, you go from, oh, it's a point of tension, we get to do our meta relating practices, to over time you can be like, oh great, all right, here's a big conversation because we couldn't figure out where to go to dinner tonight, and so now we're going to have this big practice. It's like as soon as there's any issue, we get exhausted, not at the issue itself, but at the long process we understand that we're about to launch into. But Porcelli's take on this is a little bit different, and I think it's very helpful. If we take advantage of the little moments of tension, we get our reps in, we build, we get big and strong and adept in these matters. And then what happens is you have fewer issues that have been allowed to grow into these big problems that require a lot of work in the process. It's a really important perspective if we're going to make these practices part of our spirit forward living for the long term.
I think I almost have like an amnesia, like my body, or like there's like this part of me that has an amnesia to like the power of getting through the trigger to the other side in relationship, like how good that feels. So that it's like there's this, it's like a wall that it's like I keep forgetting. I'm like, oh yeah, we're here again. We being me and the parts inside of me that are like forgetting and remembering.
Yeah.
um
Right. Well, you know, I think I can relate to what you're saying, and maybe this is my version of it. Is that that feeling of like the discomfort? Oh, here's another moment, or I'm being triggered, or this is escalating, or I don't like it, or I feel like, oh, right, I should probably address this with this person, right? Like it's getting to that point where I'm like, there's almost always, no matter how much work I've done, there's some part of me that's just like, no, can't I just
yes.
snap my
Exactly.
finger and make it go away? Like, do I have to do the thing? And it's kind of like, but there is a part of me that does remember. So maybe I don't quite have the amnesia. And like, this actually has informed how I've designed meta relating, which is like, what's the right size of the tension? I think tensions come in like big or small, right? Like, and just get used to addressing relational tensions early and often. I mean, these metaphors that are physical, like you don't just brush your teeth once, right? You do it regularly. You don't say, "Hey, lifting weights builds muscle," and then you lift weights one time, and then you go, "See, I did it." Right? No, it's the repetition of the thing that creates the result. If you kind of sort of know that that's how that works,
Right.
okay, you kind of build this confidence because if you I would say like there's sort of a default way people will do this, like the avoidance, right? It's kind of like it's too small to bother. I don't want them to think that I'm sort of thin-skinned and like I can be a bigger person and I tolerate this and that and it's no big deal. And maybe for any particular instance, it kind of isn't a big deal, right? But then there's like an accumulation, right? And then you kind of like then when you have a thing that's sort of big enough that like the fight sort of happens anyway, right? You weren't able to avoid it, then it's like, oh yeah, well, I did that because I thought that you wanted this because when that happened, I whatever. And they're like, but I was only doing that because I thought, right. And this kind of like these things sort of link in like a chain reaction. And you're like, oh wow, I have like a whole bunch of like what do you want to call them? Like triggered explosives, sort of like in a chain. Like
Yeah.
ready. And then you're like, we're not fighting about the thing that happened. Now we're sort of fighting about a whole bunch of things that no one ever said anything about,
Yeah.
like that go to the past. And then it blows up, and then everyone goes like, "See, I got to just get better at like tolerating more, or not bringing it up, or you know what I'm saying?" He's like, "No, no, no. The opposite is true. Get better at addressing it while it's still small, so that you kind of go like, oh, that wasn't that big of a deal."
Mm.
And then
Right.
over time, you're like, you don't have a backlog of like active explosives that are ready to go off, right? Right, you're like, diffuse that bomb as soon as it happens, diffuse this one as soon as it happens, and each one at a time is actually kind of manageable, right? And then you're kind of like, okay, cool. And then it's like, all right, then when the bigger thing happens, it's not like getting even bigger, right?
Right.
Because it's linked up to all these things in the past. Instead, it's kind of like, oh, right, yeah, okay, yeah, but we talked about that already.
Mm.
Okay, cool. So that's been disarmed. All right. So like, but what about? Oh yeah, we did talk about that one already. Okay, cool. So that's been now we can just focus on the thing that's happening now. You know what I mean? And like this repetition builds this confidence and hopefully overcomes your amnesia about it, right? And it gives you the it's like it's not like the like, oh man, I'd rather not feeling goes away entirely, but at least you're kind of like, yeah, but I know that that's kind of baloney because I have a track record. We have a track record. This goes well when we do it. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, I do.
Mm.
So that idea of giving people almost like structured, formulaic scripts, or like they're not so much scripts as they are templates. Hey, like address the tension, follow these steps, right? Then you go, oh, okay. Well, that was maybe a little easier than I thought it was going to be. Cool. Do it early and often. Okay, cool. Right. And then the weak creature gets stronger and stronger when you do that.
I noticed myself having uh this image of the wee creature and this like love of it. It's like a Pokemon in my mind who I'm like really rooting for all of a sudden. Okay, so at this point, we sort of broaden the conversation to a topic that's really near and dear to my heart. And if you're listening to The Container, it's probably near and dear to your heart. And that is, how do we use the strengths we build in practices like circling and authentic relating to actually improve our real relationships in all fields of our life? Like, can we translate the full power of these practices into relationships without alienating people by having to import a bunch of jargon or frames that other people haven't signed on for and they may never sign up for them? Like, how do we reap the rewards of the practice in every field of life? I mean, it all gets to kind of the central issue, which is that sometimes the tools we learn in authentic relating and circling can feel a lot less authentic and a lot less in connection to people who haven't been initiated into these groups. A lot of us probably felt that way our first time attending an authentic relating event. I remember actually sitting and hearing a lot of the instructions for certain AR games and just rolling my eyes. I ended up, luckily, getting enough reference points that I saw their power and grew immensely from them. But we have to remember that our perspective isn't everybody's perspective. And it might have been feeding me, but there are probably a lot of people out there who just would never really fall in love with authentic relating or circling. But they're part of our lives and we want to be in connection with them, or at least in this conversation we are presuming that the listener wants to be in connection with people who may not know authentic relating games or circling. A big if, I'll grant you that. Hearing you talk through that makes me curious about more of these usable practical tools or templates that
Hmm.
we can take with us in our real life and use more. So often, we talk very conceptually on this show and like in authentic relating nights or in circling, we're working with a lot of concepts and highly synthetic situations, very very
Yeah.
controlled and specific, and all the variables are tweakable, and that's not the way that talking to your family or your boss or even your friends is like.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. This kind of what I'm hearing and what you're saying is there's a kind of a cultural baggage that sort of comes from our communities of practice. Like the people that do this all the time start to develop like jargon or shorthands, right? And it's like, okay, we're gonna do that thing where we like, we've shared reality or whatever. Oh yeah, I know what you mean. You know what I mean? Like, and then you say this to somebody who's never heard this before, and like, what are you talking about, right? Like, own your experience. I'm not owning my experience. Blah blah blah. It's like, right? But in the process of learning, these things are very useful. Um, but one of the key themes in meta relating is to find the ways you can simply do it without having to like get the other person on board with a thing, right? Right. There's a difference between like communicating in a way that facilitates the interaction to go better versus like becoming a facilitator. Let me teach you this framework that I use to help people communicate better. Like if that's actually happening with like family at home or somebody who does is not into these things, they're gonna look at you a little weird. Like, well, what? It doesn't feel more authentic. It feels less authentic. You're trying to get me to follow a process that you're going to teach me in order for us to just like communicate as people. Like
Right.
that seems that feels artificial, not authentic, right?
Yes. Marshall Rosenberg talks about this in his book. Like, well, he talks about this almost, it's like a developmental phase when you start using NVC very regularly, where you've just gotten the hang of it and you're kind of like still have the training wheels on. You're not quite like it hasn't been fully integrated, and it's as though it's like you're almost using it, not maybe not even intentionally, but using it as a weapon, like because the other person doesn't know how to structure their their requests and their needs and their observations. And so,
Yes.
it becomes like more about, oh, you're not doing it right.
Right.
Because all of a sudden you know how to do it right for the first time in your whole life.
Yeah.
It's so funny. And then you're off in the weeds of like, oh, like you just said, let's learn this structure so that we can have a really, a disagreement here.
Right. Yeah. Totally. Yeah. I call this one error mode is sort of like the facilitator disease, where you start feeling like you need to become the facilitator, and the other one is just the language police, where you're sort of like, you know, I won't listen to you unless you own your experience, and the people's like,
Or like,
what?
oh, do
You
you
just
have a
don't
request?
listen.
Yeah.
That's one that we'll do that with the children a lot. Like, do you have a request? I didn't hear you make a request. I'm only hearing demands and like
Yeah.
whining.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I notice with both nonviolent communication and with things like owning your experience, which I learn like gained a lot from circling, is that in both of those you're just recruiting everyone into your value system, which is not inherent. I don't know, it's I mean, it was mind blowing for me to get the hang of those things. So, and then it's like such a weird thing to be blown away by it and then expect everyone now to be on board with it. It feels
Right.
so strange.
Yeah. Yeah. It is this kind of developmental phase where you're kind of in the middle of like, I'm on that growth trajectory, right? You're kind of like, oh, I'm still learning it. I'm still internalizing it. I got this part, but not that part yet. And like, I want to be around people who are doing it a lot. And like, this is like, I'm like, two thumbs up, if students raise their hand and go like, now it's just grating to me when people aren't owning their experience. What do I do? And I'm like, well, here. Number one is like, don't become the language police, right? That's my other one. Don't try to police their language. And I totally understand. It's totally fine to now hear that and have it sound grating to you, right? Because you're trying to improve and they're still doing the old thing,
Right.
right? But there's a difference between you owning your experience and you trying to get another person to own their experience.
Mm-hmm.
Those are totally different things,
Mm.
right? They're
Yeah.
related. Now, if we're in the context where it's like, hey, you're paying me money to come to the workshop and I'm here to teach you how to own your experience, right? There's a different sort of agreement there, right? There, hey, I'm here to help you learn how to do that and to point out when you're not, perhaps, right? Like that might be part of the deal for an exercise or for a circle, right? But like to then just like transfer that, well, I saw the trainer at the training telling other people to like own their experience, right? How come I can't do that with my friends? And it's like, well, the context is different. That's a different context. So, Marshall calls it giraffe ears. I don't know if you remember that from Marshall's stuff. Like instead of just speaking giraffe, you hear in giraffe, right? There's another thing that this author, I can't remember his name now. Oh, Fred Kaufman was his name. He said, taking 200% responsibility. You take 200. So it's like you own your experience. And then when somebody else is not owning theirs, you translate it for them in your mind,
Right. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
You're doing the
Exactly.
work in a way.
It's so, to be fair, Michael, that is so much harder to do than I can own my experience, I can notice and be in witness all day long. But when someone says something shitty, it's really hard to be like, "Oh, they're in pain."
Right.
And
It
I like
is.
how do I hear the person in pain underneath that? Or like how do I
It almost for me, and not, I'm like gonna brag, I guess. I don't know. I'm about to brag.
Brag alert.
But something that I have noticed, and this is, I teach middle schoolers, but is because middle schoolers can be so outrageously out of practice in the way they communicate.
Their
Um,
practice is very bad.
but when I hear like extremely non-owning language or victim language, it is a cue to me that they're in pain. I'm like, that isn't a cue. It's like, oh, they don't know how to do it. Like
Mm.
it's like it flags it for me now versus triggering me most of the time.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I said it was
Yes.
a brag.
Well, I would say that is an achievement beyond simply learning how to own your own experience is when you hear it this way when other people aren't. That's an additional capacity you've developed, which is good. Right. And
Right.
if I'm not perfect at it, like sometimes if I'm like under resourced or tired or in my own state of trigger, I can't do it. Right. Like, right. Like, and so how do I deal with that in a moment? But quite often I just can do it by default now, which is kind of cool, right? Like, and the other thing you can add to your little toolbox is like, oh yeah, when I'm listening to them, just repeat back to them what I hear them saying, and sometimes you just use their words, like keyword quoting, or sometimes you add a little paraphrase to let them know you're kind of really listening. And maybe sometimes you repeat it in a more owned way. Seems like you want something to happen that's different, right?
Hmm.
Yeah. Like oftentimes, sometimes they'll be like, "Well, duh," right? Like they're like, "What?" In your experience, you're like, "You want something different to happen." They're, "Yeah, okay, cool. What is that?" Right? Like, you don't have to be like, "You are not formulating a proper request," right? You just are like, "Sounds like you want something," right? Like that's a paraphrase, right? You can kind of do this extra mile, and you don't have to just purely do it in your mind only. You can add that into your active listening practice, right? Like, oh, I am actively listening by not only just trying to translate what they're saying into like more owned language, I'm actually willing to paraphrase them in a way that sounds more owned to me to let them know I'm trying my best to hear what's going on for them, right? Like you're like, "Oh, I'm signaled that they're in some pain," right? You're like, "Got it. Okay. Okay, so then now what would you say? And maybe in response to that, oh, sounds like you don't like that. I mean, if you're talking to kids, oftentimes it is really that simple. Sounds like you don't like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that feels bad, right? Feels bad. Yeah, it
Right.
feels bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, simple.
And it really does just kind of take them right down. I mean, to the, you know, often will reduce. It certainly doesn't, like, having these tools certainly doesn't usually escalate things.
Mm-hmm.
That's for sure. With these students, like, if anything, it brings it, being able to use that paraphrasing brings it down to,
Mm.
again, a workable level.
I wonder, are like paraphrasing seems like a great tool, particularly because you can kind of start using it today. Most people have the ability to reflect back what they hear. Um,
Yes.
and I'm wondering, are there any other good tools for doing this sort of on the fly translating thing? Or like sort of
Mhm.
like it's almost like building more empathy or something with
Mhm.
what you're receiving.
I think a really common one, Michael, would be like, "You are making me so mad." Like, how would you reflect back if I said, "You are making me so mad right now"?
Yeah. Sounds like you don't like something I'm doing or saying.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Want me to know that. Tell
Ooh.
me. Sounds like it feels bad. Help me understand what it is.
Hmm.
Yeah, because see, like, I hear you're making me so mad. I'm like, you're being a victim. But then you just so that's just like so masterful. It sounds like you don't like something I'm saying, or it sounds like you're actually, that is truly translating. It's like you're translating the energy of the comment, like of what is being said.
I like the you added in the desire level too of you want something, like you want me to stop or whatever. The adding in the desire is, it lets them know that you're interpreting a desire for one, uh and can get you on the same page. But and there's like a vulnerability in that on both sides if we're talking about a desire now.
Hmm.
And so much of anger is a desire.
Yeah.
Anger, well, a lot of strong emotions have a desire underneath them that
Hmm.
is not being met.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's different ways of sort of distilling it, and one of these is just like use shorter phrases, like in the authentic relating world. Once we start to kind of unpackage our internal dynamics, and it's like, yes, and this is, it's like this, and it's reminding me of that, and this one part of me is saying this, and this other part of me is saying that, right? Blah blah blah, right? Or you can even do that on the receptive end, where you're sort of like, sounds like maybe there's like a struggle between some part of you that's like this or that, or da, 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 da. Like it's fine to like, if that's a shared language, but if you start doing that to like your cousin over the holidays, they're going to be like, what in the fuck are you talking about, right? So they're like simple things like, sounds like you want something, sounds like you don't like that, sounds like you like that, right? Like, I get it, or I can understand why you would feel that way, right? Just these are simple things in kind of everyday language, right? Like, you want something to go differently right now, is that right? Like, can really help, right? And part of it is this internal empathy that you're doing. You're kind of like, okay, I got to be available, right? Some of it is sort of like, is there a part of me that's just vibing with their emotional frequency, right? Then sometimes there's like a response, which is sort of a distinct feeling. Well, this is the impact. Okay, what's the impact that I'm feeling from what they're saying? Okay, but then there's also kind of a cognitive part where it's like, what do I think is going on for them, or true for them, or what are they believing, or
Mm.
how are they making sense of the situation? That's the cognitive component of empathy, right? Once you kind of do that, then you can do these communication practices. And I have like three categories for that too. One is the keyword quoting. The other one is paraphrasing. The other one is called empathic conjecture, where it's like you're actually saying something that they didn't say. Oh, and then you say this, I imagine that when you said this, that this other thing was going on for you, right? And that's the farthest leap. But if you're owning it, if you, instead of saying like, oh, you're just responding to your childhood wounding, right? You can just be like, I imagine that. Like some of these little key phrases like you seem or I imagine that are really good to kind of give you that owned language to make a kind of leap. And sometimes, especially when you do the bigger leap, like the empathic conjecture, can be amazing. It can be amazingly connective. Wow, I just, sounds like you want something and I imagine that blah. And the person's like, whoa, it almost feels like you're kind of mind reading them when it lands. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But if they're like, no, that's not it, then you're like, cool. So that's not it. Well, what is it then? Right? Or you kind of sort of lean in with this positivity. It's like, no, no, no. Let me explain to you why I think this is true for you. No, you can just let it go. You know what I'm saying? Like you were making a guess and they're saying no. And now you just say, okay, cool. What is it then? Hopefully these are helping make it more everyday language for you. Am I on the right track here?
For sure.
Definitely.
Yeah, it has me really excited, like thinking about interacting with people today even.
Yeah, I want to go get in a fight now.
I mean, I'm thinking about like my drive home with my 13-year-old, like from school, and what one thing that one question that's coming up for me, and I hope I didn't cut you off, is when it comes to, say, like really close friends or family, well, yeah, and even work colleagues, I think um that all of these things we're talking about are very reasonable, and I can imagine doing them in many situations, but I think I think there's like the challenge of balancing sharing what my experience is in the interaction,
Yeah.
and like sharing what is going on for me evenly. It's like I think we've been talking about a lot about what to do when you're kind of receiving the communication from another, but I'm curious about like the sharing of one's own experience so that other people are getting your reality in a way that,
Yeah.
yeah.
I love it. Yeah. I want to go into that at the technique level, the communication practice level, but I just want to say at the relational level, like this is back to the third thing, like the entity, the relational entity, right? Like it needs both, right? Like in a way, it's like, okay, who's doing more of the talking, right? Like, oh, I'm talking a lot. Actually, I'm getting bored of myself talking. I want to hear from them, right? That's actually, you're kind of tuning into kind of some relational entity need. Oh, they're talking a lot. Well, hang on a second. Like, I've been listening to you. I think I'm following you, but there's a lot there. You know, I want to just pause to make sure I'm getting what you're saying. I have some thoughts I want to add to the conversation, right? Like the relationship needs kind of this balance. And this other one where it's like, oh, like their experience is now entering into our shared reality. Cool. That's the receptivity part that you're pointing out. Okay. But what about my experience, right? When you're kind of sensing, it's like my experience feels like it's getting kind of crowded out here. Right. Another way of interpreting that is like, hey, the relationship wants your experience to be incorporated into the shared reality here because it needs it. It needs both. Right.
Ooh, yeah, I
Make
love
sense?
that. I love that framing. Yes.
Mm.
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. I mean, at this level, at the relational entity level, it's like, it's almost like our responsibility to share our desires and our experience because it needs it, right? That's what fuels its life is
Mhm.
our willingness to address the tensions that are in the relationship. It is the potential energy that is, when you address the tension, is transformed into action, which is the life of the relationship. Like you have to, in a way, if you just withhold it all, the relationship becomes very anemic. It just kind
Mm.
of like doesn't have that life energy being fed into it. So, sharing yours. I have one sort of universal technique, which is like a pre step before talking. And I call this connecting with inclusive purpose. I want to say something. I want to speak my truth. I want to be authentic. I want to be real. I need to let you know how I'm feeling and what I think, right? Can be super valuable, but I often say, like, before you do that, can you imagine or sense, like, my sharing this experience could amount to something good for me, for them, and for our relationship? That's like tuning into the three-part inclusive purpose before you speak. It doesn't mean
Whoa.
predict it. Go ahead. Go ahead.
That's just gold. Like I mean it's so incredibly simple. But this one little trick, it's like I'm imagining it right now. I'm like, yeah, like actually that it could result in something positive is such a simple way to think of it. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. It just sort of shifts your internal orientation and even like changes maybe your tone of voice or even the words you might use to describe your experience before you start saying it, right? It's like, yeah. And it gets tricky here because sometimes some people are like, well, I have a hard time imagining that this is going to go well based on our track record, right? And I'm like, so let it be a little bit of a fantasy, right? It doesn't have to be accurate. You're not trying to go for like, I'm predicting the good thing that's going to happen. And my goal is to be as accurate in my prediction as possible. The goal here is just to like shift your orientation towards the possibility of something good that you can imagine. That's it. That's the thing that shifts your tone of voice. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes, I do.
So yeah, I mean that's the first step. But then I imagine the following steps you probably know, which is like when you're describing your experience, own your experience. Use the ownership language. Speak as though you're conveying to them that you understand that you are talking about your experience, right? Because then that kind of dissolves this kind of like true or not true or factual or not factual or right or wrong thinking. I was like, oh, they're just sort of sharing. It's a disarming thing and actually makes them more likely to receive what you're saying. That's one of the powers of owning your experiences. Like it makes them actually more receptive to hearing you. But another one people often forget is that, like, I may want or need a particular kind of response in order for me to feel like you are hearing and understanding me.
Mm,
So I don't know how often this I didn't really find this in authentic relating practices and culture all that much with all that much emphasis if it ever appeared, but like this is I call it requesting the response you want.
interesting.
So be like, can you just let me know what you hear me saying? That could be one.
Yeah.
Or I could be like, tell me what it's like to hear when I'm sharing this. So I'm asking them to share impact, basically. Or I might say, can you let me know what you think of what I'm saying? Whatever this is, right? You can ask for it.
That fucking rules. It reminds me of something that you mentioned when we spoke many weeks ago, and you were like,
Mhm.
people, those of us who circle into authentic relating and all these practices, we shouldn't be expecting other people to be at our level. We should be using our experience to actually like raise the connection. And that is
Yes.
such a good way to do it, where you're just requesting these kind of like these you're requesting a move, so they're totally free to do it if it feels good to them or not. You're not like manipulating them, but you're kind of using your experience and your practice uh to encourage more feeding of the we creature. And it's just, yeah, it's such a interesting move. Again, it's so simple, but I've never thought to do that, to be a just request from someone else to make one of these circly or like authentic moves. Like why not why not do that?
It also prompts for me, like hearing, like thinking through that as a practice, it prompts me to check in and see, is there actually like maybe an agenda that I hadn't realized I had, or an expectation I was not tracking in myself. Like, it would probably be a few like reps of it not going well to be able to determine that. but
Mhm.
but putting that thought, that kind of pre-thought into like, how do I, what response am I actually looking for? Because I often find myself um feeling let down or something by a response when I haven't even requested, or put to words what I'm actually wanting, or thought, even put to my own like consideration what it is that I'm wanting. So that, yeah, I really appreciate that. It's so so smart.
Yeah. There you go. Yeah. Start with the inclusive purpose. That's internal. Own your experience. That's how you shape the language of what you're sharing, and then requesting the response you want kind of completes the loop. And like that completion of the loop, I think a lot of times people think, well, I just talk and then people listen, and then I just assume that they're understanding me, right? Like, which is
Yeah.
actually a very safe assumption a lot of the time, especially with people you're familiar with or whatever, like people you've known for a long time, or people who speak the same language you do. Like there's a lot of that that's just it's fine to assume that because it's a practical assumption. However, like when it kind of comes down to like what's going on here, there's maybe a misunderstanding happening. I'm feeling tension rising, or especially when you're like, hey, I actually have a thing I want to talk to you about regarding our relationship. Oftentimes it's like, right. For me to really be satisfied that I'm being heard and understood, I need that loop to close. Right. And those two things, you doing the sharing and them doing the responding, is the thing that the relationship needs. It needs both of those things to create the shared understanding.
So this is the part of the conversation where we start to land the plane. We weave in our personal experiences to see how these tools, these super practical tools of meta relating, actually work in the real world. And then we also talk about our shared love of models and system building. So it's like application, it's theory, it's applied theory. What a time to be alive.
The other day, we were having an intense conversation, and at the end, it had to end because of a time constraint, like because of a meeting or something, and it didn't feel like it was quite wrapped up. And I remember I was said, "Can I tell you where I think we are, like where I think we've been and where we are now?" And sort of did a recap of like my experience of the conversation and like what if there were still action items or like next steps or something. And that like it closed it out in a way that made it feel really like clean and just a really lovely way of ending what was a challenging interaction. And right?
Yeah.
Am I right?
Yeah, well, it was strange because we actually had figured out very little. We had opened up a lot of really big stuff, but closing out the conversation made it feel like we have like closed that off and we're good and we will return to this, and
Yeah.
rather than like having a bunch of stuff up in the air. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Just saying that out loud, right? Like this is to bring the meta thing back in. That is like a form of meta communication. It's like communicating about your communication, which to me is just one version of the relational mode of conversation. You're kind of saying, like, right, I like this conversation so far. We got to go. There's more to say. I'm looking forward to picking it up. Right. Like
Yeah.
there's even ways of transitional things because it's kind of funny if you're like, I've been in social gatherings with a lot of, I would say, like neuroatypical divergent people, and sometimes you're kind of like you're just talking with somebody and somebody sort of walks up and then they don't say anything and then they walk away and they never said anything, and I'm just like, I did not understand what was happening for this person at all, right? And I could have been like, hey, welcome, what's going on, right? Like, or something like that. But also if I'm that person sort of walking up, I'm like, hey, like I'm here, or hi there, right? Or like, where did this end? Cool. I love this. This is great. Right. I'm looking forward to more, or whatever it is. Like there are little phrases that are kind of, I would say they're facilitative in a way where it's not, you're not trying to impose this giant structure, but they are kind of like, oh, it's a form of meta communication about where a conversation currently is. Right. Like that's also very helpful. Right. And that's kind of like closing the loop. It's also kind of keeping in mind, what does the relationship need? See what I'm saying? Like, I think this is great stuff that you're doing, right? And there's ways of making that sound less strange and more just normal to people who aren't, because people do this all the people already do these kinds of things, right?
Right.
It's already like every culture has some version of like um I think in English it's a lot like how are you? How are you just means like I acknowledge that you're there. it doesn't actually mean I'm interested in hearing how you are, right? Like, you see what I'm saying? Or if somebody says
Yeah.
hi there, that's sort of saying like I'm creating an opportunity to have a conversation. Hi there, right? That's it's just a social convention. So like these social conventions are often little forms of meta communication
Mm.
Mm.
that worth being aware of the role they play in our relational dynamics. This is some of the stuff I didn't borrow from authentic relating. This is some of the stuff I kind of got from more research I did into interpersonal communication kind of fields of study. Which I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, that's a thing that people do. That's right.
You're doing a lot of research on conversation analysis
Mm.
recently.
Yeah, and
Like,
ethnomethodology.
yeah, ethnomethodology.
Yeah, that stuff is really, really granular. It's awesome.
Yeah.
And I remember reading, like, I was reading this textbook on conversation analysis and being like, all there people have already mapped out all of this stuff. And
Yes.
sometimes when I'm in like authentic relating and circling spaces, there's a lot of like it's from Ken Wilber. A lot of the people are like disciples of Ken Wilber. So you would
Yeah.
think there'd be tons of systems, but actually there's um, I find kind of a paucity of good, definite language around a lot of this stuff.
Mm,
And yeah, and like, but then you read like conversation analysis, that's probably too academic, but it's really nice to have systematizers like you out there who are like incorporating a lot of these maps that have been created and figuring out just more precise models that we can be thinking inside of. Um, Whereas I think a lot of the culture, which is good because most people are this way, but I guess I love systems too. So like I have a preference in my heart. Um,
yeah.
yeah, but sometimes I think a lot of people the most system they have in their head are like a handful of agreements and some phrases and like some truisms. And yeah, I guess this is me wanting to maybe move into more of the systems you've devised here at the end of our conversation.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I'll just kind of link it back to the integral thing, right? Like I was part of the authentic relating and circling kind of community in the Bay Area. And I was also kind of independently got really into integral. And then when I, found that there was like this common interchange between the two, I got pretty excited. I'm like, oh, my circling nerds are into Ken Wilber too, or some of them are. And like, this is pretty cool. And then we went and sort of moved the whole training deal out of San Francisco and to Boulder, where we created the Integral Center. Um, and it is now since closed. But like that was like it was kind of a breath of fresh air because like that space would have sort of like these more old school integral people kind of doing their conferences and like their their way of communicating was so often just being channeled through the system itself that it
Wha-
was like, what about you, or what about what you want, or what about how you're feeling, you know what I'm saying? And it was like they could only really talk about things in like theoretical language. It was so removed, and I was like, oh, this is why our authentic relating and circling stuff is going to be dynamite over here, right? It's because it kind of gets people out of the abstractions and into the embodied like interactiveness that's happening in the here and now, right? Like it's like, okay, that's cool, but then it is also cool to have some framework that is either guiding the practice or that you can use. So one of our favorite things to do would be to do the debrief period. So like we would do like a circle. And sometimes we'd have like somewhat long debriefs. And it's like, all right. So then hey, students, now is your time to ask me why I did what I did, or what did you observe in the dynamics of this circle, right? And these things I often am not saying them while I'm doing them. I just enact them, right? And there's a difference between like I can say there's a thing called empathic conjecture where like I imagine maybe something that's going on for you that you didn't say. And then if it lands, it feels like I've read your mind, right? And that's pretty cool, right? But like I don't go like, I'm gonna offer you an empathic conjecture, right? Like when I'm, you know what I'm saying? I'm just gonna
Yeah.
say, I imagine that blah, right? And then I'll say the thing, right? Like, so it's helpful to have essentially a framework that says, okay, the baseline, the starting point is a thing called relational tensions. This is the first thing. Then you're like, all right, that is an opportunity to have a relational conversation. Okay, that means we're going to be talking about our relationship. Cool. Then once you're in there, then there's sort of like these things we were talking about. How much of their experience and how much of my experience, right? Is there any requests or are there not requests? Like there's a lot of places, where I've kind of really spelled out different sort of conversational goals, you might say. Like a simple one is like, I want to be heard and understood. Cool. This is what happened for me. Would you respond in this way? Then you respond and like, check. I feel heard and understood. Good to go. But there might be more. It might be, no, no, what's going on for you? Okay. Well, when this situation happened between us, I want to share and I want to know what happened for you. Okay, cool. Now what we're doing is we're doing another thing. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. That's their achievement. Now we both have shared reality about what each other's experience of the incident was. Cool. That might be good. I call it achieving clarity. You have clarity now. All right. Oh, but I want to ask for something. I want right. I want things to go differently in the future. Okay, maybe you're making a request for an action, or maybe you want to create an ongoing agreement. Like when this type of thing happens, then we do this instead of that. Right? Like, cool. Do we have agreement about that? So all of these things are kind of like pieces, right? And you could follow the template, the step-by-step procedure if you want, because it's sort of like coaching on a piece of paper that will kind of coach you through the conversation if you want. But it's also an analytical tool if you kind of are like, well, we got into a thing and that sure blew up. I wonder what went wrong, right? And then you could be like, well, let's look at what step did we skip maybe. You know what I'm saying? You could use it as a rubric to sort of like diagnose how a conversation maybe got derailed like
Yeah.
after the fact. Is this giving you some better idea of like this kind of applied theoretical thing that
Yeah.
I do with?
For sure. That's really good.
Yeah, I like how tactical it is. It gives you this lay of the land and how to just navigate there in the moment. And I think that what I'm really coming away with is the doorway of tension. That's the doorway to a discussion about the relationship, and
Yes.
that simple connection. I love that you started there. It really um it's so I think that is really something I could like remember for the rest of my life. Just tension is a doorway. Tension in a relationship is a doorway to a discussion about the relationship, and that's yeah. I don't. That is like
Instead of
hard
a
learned.
discussion about the specific tension at a granular
Yeah.
level to the point where you're just arguing over like,
Hmm.
a few comments about one instance. It's, which those things can all be like dissected within that, like if, to the degree that we would want them to be, within the overall relational conversation. But that,
Mhm.
yeah, I mean, I feel like I've just taken a master class from you, so thank you.
Yeah. I feel the same way. I feel really grateful for your transmission around how to use the kinds of things we learn in these really almost hermetically sealed spaces,
Yeah.
that we learn so many beautiful, we know that's like why people get a like, I cannot be pried away from these practices because they're so powerful to me. There's nothing I've ever experienced is this powerful.
Yeah.
and and I want to share that with people, but so often sharing that with people is like asking them to play on your terms, and they are not either interested or like they, that's not their jam. And so it ends up being like creating ease in some ways, but then added tension in relationships and others. And
Yes.
having, yeah, having this framework is a wonderful place to sort of like confidently move into those conversations with people who maybe aren't, you know extremely interested in curious in how I'm doing right now or whatever.
They may never be in a way that like our community of practice is, and in a way it's kind of like that's also fine. I want to introduce one more kind of concept that's related to this relational entity. It's this idea of like called right relationship. And it's not like it's a destination or it's even like the same thing for every relationship, right? Like for a relationship to be right, they all need to be this way, right? Because it's like, okay, you love it, I love it, but mom, dad, cousin, they're never maybe gonna love it the way that I love it. And if I sort of get into this weird thing where it's like, I think that they need to change or be different so that they do this thing the way that I want to do it, then we can have the relationship that we're meant to have. And I'm like,
Mm,
no, no, no. Right. That's like imposing your egocentric idea of what the relationship is supposed to be onto a relationship. But the relationship is just going to be what it is. Right. Like, it's like whatever is sort of like mutual and consensual and appropriate for that person and you in the circumstances in which you find yourself. That is what right relationship is. It's not a
uh,
destination. It's sort of like, is it going in the right direction based on where it actually is? Right. And it might be, I never get to explore those depths of my internal parts like with my cousin. But you know what? I get to do another thing that I really enjoy with my cousin. And that's the right relationship for that one. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes.
mm,
Yeah, I do. I really do.
yeah. This has been such a wonderful, incredible transmission, Michael. I'm I know that so many of our listeners are going to want to get more of your work and to learn more from you. And so I want to end with you telling them exactly how they can do that.
Yeah. So metarelating.com is the website. You can find us on social media. Just use metarelating as a handle. YouTube, we're on there. And coming up, I'm going to do a couple of free events this fall holiday season uh, to talk about relational dynamics and communication with your family of origin. Because in a lot of ways, those relationships sort of stick with us for a lifetime, or maybe we feel like we're stuck with them, right? And kind of exploring this kind of like, what is the right relationship for these? And like, how do I move it from where it actually is in a direction that's more enjoyable and mutual, all around, right? In a lot of ways, it's complicated because those imprints from our early life kind of stick with us. They influence how our future relationships go, and they often feel kind of like the advanced level or something, right? You go back to your people that you've known for decades or you grew up with, and you're kind of like, oh wow, I just regressed into some earlier version of my going on, right? Like, so we're gonna, have some opportunity to share what that's like in a community environment, and I'll try to offer some tips. So it's gonna be like a free series of webinars online here for the end of 2024, and you can find information about that. The information about that's going to be going up rather soon. So probably by the time this recording goes out to the container audience, it'll be up there.
Awesome. Ah, Michael Porcelli, thank you so much for coming on to the container. This is incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah, right on. So fun. Thanks for having me. Let's do it again sometime.
Let's do it. The container is now closed. Michael Porcelli's devotion to creating practical, useful tools has this power to rapidly change your life for the better. For that reason, we're really grateful to have him on to share some of those tools and point you in the right direction if you want to learn more from this master of human relating. Over the next 2 months, Porcelli is offering some free events to give you skills for those hyper intense relating points. Thanksgiving dinner, the holidays. Folks, rather than arguing with your aunts and uncles about the election, why don't you build powerful connection? Go to MetaRelating.com for that material and all of Porcelli's work, and we have links in the show notes to point you in the right direction. Again, if you'd like to support us, which I know you would, go to patreon.com/thecontainer. Put down your $5 every month to get access to exclusive content, and the most exclusive content of all is the warm glow inside your heart knowing that you're supporting the work that we do. With that, ladies and gentlemen, we have a nice way of closing. Keep it namaste.